Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. If you are here, you are joining the SAC States Hornets Policy and Politics Lunch and Learn Part 2 of our budget series. With us are very, very important VIPs is Ross Brown from the LAO and Joe Stevenson from the Department of Finance. And this conversation is going to be moderated by David DeLuz. So welcome, welcome, welcome. We are here for 1 hour. We are not going to read our VIP's bio because you do have them in your invite. This is not to disrespect them, but only to maximize the time that we have with them. And a big thank you that they take time from their busy schedule. We recognize that this is a very, very busy schedule for both Ross and Joe, and also for David. And we appreciate all of you for joining. This has become an annual event for us, and we hope this is as enjoyable and as educational for you as it is for us. So, without further ado, I am going to transfer the forum to David DeLuz. And so here you go, David. Thank you so much for joining us.
You, Sylvia. I want to first of all say welcome to all of you. I want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to be here. We're here for a good time, not a long time, so we're going to jump right into the questions for Ross and for Joe. So, okay, gentlemen, to start us off, could you please take a moment to explain the role of your respective offices and the role that each plays in the budget process and where your perspectives or approaches align, and more importantly, where they might sometimes diverge. Why don't we start with Ross?
Yeah, thanks, David, and thanks for the invitation to participate. So I think maybe I'll start with I'm not sure sort of the audience and kind of how familiar they are with the budget process, but just kind of at a very high level, the state budget process kind of follows a pretty typical schedule where the governor will release a budget in the beginning of January. Then the legislature will deliberate over that budget and the proposals from the governor over the next several months. The governor will then sort of propose a revision in May, known as the May revision. The legislature will then kind of look at that revised budget proposal, and then over the next several weeks, we'll deliberate over that and then ultimately adopt a budget by the middle of June. And so I think, when it comes to kind of the role that our office plays and the Department of Finance, Joe can sort of speak to the Department of Finance role, but I think we have a lot of similarities where we both are fiscally focused offices that are focused on the state budget. We do a lot of the similar work in terms of, we both develop forecasts, independent forecasts of revenues and expenditures that inform that budget process and the development of the budget. We look at kind of programs and try to assess sort of the effectiveness and cost effectiveness and efficiency of different programs. I think the main difference between our office really just sort of revolves around where we sit and kind of which branch of government we work for. So here at the LAO, we are a legislative office. We work for the legislature and the legislative branch of government. And so we like to say sort of we have 120 bosses. So there's 120 members of the legislature, 40 senators and 80 assembly members. And so when we're sort of analyzing the budget and proposals from the governor and the administration, our role is to kind of provide advice to the legislature and all 120 members. We're a nonpartisan office, so our advice, we're providing it to members of both parties and for both houses. And a lot of our work really sort of revolves around analyzing the proposals that come forward from the governor and the Department of Finance, You're looking at revenue and cost estimates, providing our own assessment of those, looking at proposals for new spending in some cases. In some cases, maybe it's a reduction in spending, the merits and drawbacks of those different proposals, flagging potential alternatives that the legislature might want to think about as it's developing its and adopting its own budget, and looking for ways to kind of make programs more efficient along the way. So, but with everything being sort of focused on advising the legislature and the members of the legislature. So, I mean, I guess I think you also asked about sort of the different perspectives that we bring. I think we share a lot of the same sort of lenses that we look at the budget through. I think just at a high level, I view sort of the fact that both we have a Department of Finance and an LAO providing sort of our own sort of views on the state's budget situation, our own views on forecasting revenues and forecasting spending and kind of the merits of different programs as a real advantage of kind of the state budget process. I think it's healthy to kind of have some different perspectives and views on forecasting things those are things that are sort of very uncertain and are subject to some judgment that sort of goes into kind of what methods you use to forecast things, how you sort of view the condition of the budget, and having kind of a couple different sort of sets of eyes on that to sort of inform policymakers and the big important decisions that they have to make around the budget. I think I view as sort of just a really healthy part of the state budgeting process, having sort of both our office for the legislature and then the Department of Finance for the executive branch. So I'll kind of leave it there for now. Happy to answer any follow-up questions to that, but hand it over to Joe for his take on the question.
Yeah, Joe.
Yeah,
your perspective.
Yeah. Thanks, Ross, and thanks, David. So I'm with the Department of Finance. Ross did a good job of outlining the state's, generally outlining the state's budget process or timeline. We have a few different roles here at the Department of Finance, but our main role, what we're most known for, is being the governor's chief fiscal advisor and creating the governor's budget proposal that we present to the legislature. So every year we begin in the early fall on creating what becomes the governor's budget for the subsequent fiscal year that we present to the legislature by January 10th of every year. And so that will be for the upcoming fiscal year that starts on July 1st. So we work with our departments and agencies on their budget needs, their proposals, mainly typically what they need to continue to meet the requirements of delivering programs and services that Californians rely upon, and then sometimes also expanding those programs and services. As Ross mentioned, we also do forecasts that are used to frame our budget proposals. So we do both the economic and revenue forecast for the governor's budget, and we do it again for the May revision. After January 10th, we work with the legislature on eventually what will become the final budget for the state. That process really begins in the legislature with their committee and subcommittee hearings. And so our staff, along with Ross's staff, will go to these hearings and will present the proposals that are in the governor's budget to the legislature there. Ross's team will provide their input on how they evaluate our proposals in that process. And that's really the public process of hearing the issues and items that are being proposed in the budget, and for the legislature to ask their questions, eventually make their decisions. We provide a couple of updates to our proposal that we proposed to the legislature in January. The biggest one being in May, which is really our last update to the budget, and that is big because it also includes our updated forecasts, and those really inform the framework for the final budget. And then after May, we work for the governor, representing the administration in negotiations and finalizing a budget with the legislature. As Ross mentioned, it has to be done by mid-June. In terms of, I would just concur with kind of Ross's statements on kind of the differences. I also think it is a positive um, aspect of our budget process here in Sacramento that we have these two offices that are providing input and really focused on California's financial well-being, while also meeting the priorities and directives both of my boss, the governor, and the legislature. I would also just add that I think oftentimes, the big thing that kind of gets attention in the media, at least, is differences between our offices, and particularly as it relates to revenue forecasts. And I think just kind of picking up on points that Ross were making, that we each have staff, economists and staff who develop our forecasts. They do it in different methods. And I know in the public, it appears that there's often disagreements, or we're not aligned in terms of forecast, but it's actually, I think, from my perspective, not the case. And we often understand the approaches that each of our offices are taking, and most times believe that we're both taking reasonable approaches to how we conduct our forecasts.
Thank you, Joe. We've both of you, I think, touched on this idea of, looking at your forecasts and policy priorities, and given exigent circumstances, making adjustments. We've all seen the price of gas and groceries and rent, and we've seen the ebb and flow in the job market. So there's overall, I think, a sense of economic uncertainty right now. How do policymakers decide when to protect existing programs versus scaling back spending, especially in what can be viewed as questionable economic questionable economic conditions? And we'll start with Joe on this one.
Yeah. So I think that, I was around and working on budgets for the state during the Great Recession, and there was a huge shock to the state's revenues at that time, and tough decisions that had to be made that were cutting funding for programs and services that had some real impacts. And I think a lot of the state learned a lesson from that time, and that really informed really how we approached the last 3 years. Because even notwithstanding the current uncertainty that we're facing, the state has actually experienced some significant budget problems the last 3 years, coming out of a spike in revenue coming out of the pandemic, and then seeing a huge significant correction. And with that correction of having some budget deficits that we've had to address the last 3 years. And so in doing that, and again, learning like lessons from the past, it was really important for the governor, and I can't speak for legislature, but I know that also for the legislature, in terms of ensuring that we were prioritizing protecting programs that serve the state's most vulnerable, and to put money in folks' pockets, or food on folks' plates, and that's really the approach that was taken these last couple of years, as we've had to still make some pretty tough decisions. Unfortunately, we still are facing a lot of uncertainty, not only from some of the factors that you've pointed out, and some of those even driven by the current state of what's going on across the globe, and particularly the war and how that may impact our state's finances going forward. Because as as oil prices go up, inflation concerns start to increase. We has, as you noted, we've seen some issues related to job market that have could potentially have some downside effects on our economy and forecast going forward. And stock markets have been very volatile lately. And so all those things do impact our state's economy and potentially revenue. And so will lead to continued uncertainty here. But I think we will continue to take that same approach of ensuring that we're protecting the state's most vulnerable, but doing so in ways that we also have to understand how we can balance the state's budget. Last point I'll make there is that we have a volatile revenue system structure in California, and I think that's something that we're also beginning to understand better coming out of the pandemic on how on the extent of that volatility. And that's something that we also are focused on and ensuring that we are able to better manage that volatility going forward, and in doing so, be able to protect programs and services.
Briefly, Joe, just one real quick follow-up. What makes our revenue mix and profile so volatile?
Probably the biggest factor is that we purposely have a progressive tax system, and that in doing so, high income taxpayers pay larger share of revenues. I think it was from the 20-year period going into 22, 23, I believe, the top 1% averaged 45% of our personal income taxes. And because of that, and a lot of our high income earners receive income from sources like capital gains and stock-based compensations, and so those things could be more volatile than salaries, and so that really drives a lot of what we see in volatility in our system, which is again purposeful, but also we have to be mindful of it and understand how to best manage it.
Wow. 1% drives 45% of the revenue. That is wild. Ross, LAO's perspective on the question, given all the economic uncertainty, what drives sort of this decision to protect programs versus scaling back?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with kind of a lot of pieces of what Joe said. I think maybe I'll just add, I think we think of it as there's kind of a couple of different pieces to kind of the decision-making process and sort of thinking through, how to sort of structure a budget and kind of put the state on strong fiscal footing. There's sort of the cyclical kind of aspect to the budget, which you're getting at with your question around kind of volatility around revenue. And that can change quickly and by a lot year to year. And a lot of that based on because sort of our revenue is very dependent on stock market conditions. And so that can change a lot. And so, part of the sort of challenge in developing a state budget is sort of making sure that, the state is kind of preparing for any potential downturns there. And so, I mean, right where we are now is our view is sort of we see, the state's revenues have been pretty strong in recent years, but we see those sort of revenue gains as being on pretty shaky ground because they have been fueled a lot by strong stock market returns, a lot of that being fueled by enthusiasm around artificial intelligence. And there's a lot of indicators to suggest that that might not be sustainable. And so not sort of thinking of that sort of revenue boom as something that's sustainable over the long term. And so kind of preparing for a potential downturn is sort of in the short term an important part of kind of the budget conversation. And that means limiting sort of spending and making sure we're sort of careful with the money that's coming in now and thinking of ways to build reserves or, limit the amount of borrowing that we do. So there's sort of that kind of shorter term cyclical question. I think that's important. The other one I think that's part of conversations now are around the sort of longer term structure of the budget, where I think both our office and the Department of Finance see significant kind of deficits in future years over the next few years. If you look out at the state's projected spending and revenues, we have spending exceeding revenues by ranges from 20 to $35 billion per year. And so those are kind of ongoing issues, which present a sort of different set of challenges where kind of, having a big reserve won't necessarily sort of help address that problem. That's more of an issue of like aligning the state's overall kind of revenues and expenditure trends. And so that's where you get into, not just sort of one-time solutions, but thinking through the overall kind of size of state government, how much revenue do we collect? How much are we spending on an ongoing basis? And where are there ways to kind of get those more in line with one another? And so there's a lot of different considerations that go into selecting sort of, how to do that, whether you prefer sort of revenue solutions or spending solutions and which spending solutions. A lot of those depend on policymakers' priorities. I think we try to kind of offer advice on, try to give policymakers a sense of what are we getting for the money that we're spending in different programs? What are the outcomes? What are sort of the core services that state government provides versus maybe what might be a local service, and sort of where can the state kind of focus its limited resources. But there's a lot of different kind of considerations to go into those questions. But ultimately, it's sort of this bigger picture budget questions around kind of both dealing with the volatility as well as just kind of the overall ongoing kind of spending and revenues.
Okay. So I actually want to stay here just for a little bit because you both brought up, I think, some very good points. The question I have is around this whole idea of the bigger picture. The way that we commonly see the process rolled out is, as observers or consumers of the final budget, we see it as a repetitive, iterative process. Every year we produce a budget, this, that, and the other. But you're talking about there has to be some development of a shared vision of what the future looks like. And so my question is does that shared vision come out of the perspectives gained out of this iterative, repetitive annual effort, or are there on the side of this, are there broader conversations that the DOF is having with the LAO, or are there ongoing sort of grand bargain conversations that are going on around the direction of the direction of the state's finance structure? Is there anything like that going on, or is it just every year we sort of do battle and we sort of end up where we end up?
So I think it's the way I would frame it is that it's part of the yearly budget conversation. The state, when we're required to, and when we put out what is kind of our general fund condition that shows the condition of the state's general fund, that we not only do it for the budget year, but we do it for the 3 subsequent fiscal years after that. And so as part of the budget planning and development process, we're looking at, the priority is the budget year, but really what the impacts are of the decisions we're making today, how that's going to impact the budget year after that, and then the 2 budget years after that. So we have an idea of, are we developing a sustainable budget plan for the state based on our current projections? And so that's, I think, something that is came out of the Great Recession, is a lesson that that we can't just look at the budget year and do this iterative year-to-year process without understanding what the impacts are going to be in the out years, and being able to plan for sustaining our budget over time, to ensure that we are providing stability to the programs and services that folks in the state rely upon.
Okay. Ross, any response or anything else to add
Yeah,
on
no,
that?
I kind of it's it's kind of, you have to kind of keep both things in mind. I think there's the sort of explicit task around sort of developing a budget for the upcoming fiscal year, and that's kind of focusing on, you know, what resources are available, and there's a constitutional requirement for a balanced budget, and so that's kind of for the immediate task at hand for sort of budget makers and policymakers. But as part of that, I think it is important to be thinking about the longer term and thinking about kind of, you know, what decisions being made today, how they impact the budget over the subsequent several years, to kind of put the state and in a kind of sustainable position going forward. So you're not sort of making decisions now that make kind of your life much difficult in the future when, you know, you look out in the future. If there's a big problem, then, you know, if you're kind of expanding some program now, but you have budget deficits in the future, for example, then that means you're gonna have to make kind of bigger reductions elsewhere in the future, or, you know, tax increases in the future or something along those lines. So kind of having that longer term vision in mind when you're making decisions that are, you know, each budget bill is sort of adopted really for kind of a year essentially, but when you're making those decisions at that time for developing that budget, thinking about the longer term is a really important part of the process. Oh, you're on mute, David.
Thank you. Thank you both very much. Sorry about that. I appreciate the window into the broader thinking of both organizations. So that was very valuable. Uh, Next question. So when new programs are proposed in the budget, what kinds of information do you need in order to determine whether they're really ready for implementation?
Go ahead, Ross.
Do you want to go,
Yeah.
Joe? I'll kick it off. Joe might
Sorry about that.
Joe might you know, Joe can add on or offer a different perspective. I mean, I think starting at the most basic level, kind of what's the goal of the program? What are sort of the primary objectives, I think, is one of the, and I'll just kind of run through, I think, kind of some of the questions that our office might ask as we're sort of thinking about, you know, or we're analyzing new proposals or thinking about new proposals. You know, what's the goal or kind of problem that's trying to be addressed? What's the sort of state role in kind of addressing that problem? I mentioned earlier a little bit about, you know, one of the things our office thinks quite a bit about is, you know, the different levels of government and what their kind of historical roles are in providing different types of services. So there's sort of a question around, you know, is this kind of an appropriate role for the state to be playing versus maybe a county or a city in kind of providing a particular service or addressing a particular problem? You know, what are sort of expected outcomes? These are kind of like, I think, policy questions that we would sort of ask as we're looking into it. When it comes to kind of more like, is the administrative infrastructure sort of in place, ready to sort of roll out a program? You know, there are important questions about what sorts of kind of resources does an agency or state department have to, you know, administer new grants, for example, if there's sort of a new grant program being proposed. I mean, I'll say, I think our observation around, you know, a few years ago when the state had some surpluses and began to allocate money to a large number of one-time programs, it took, in some cases, quite a bit of time to get that money out the door because there was a huge influx of funding for some programs that was not used to administering that level of funding. And so just purely kind of the staff and kind of processes in place needed to kind of get that money out the door. It just wasn't quite there, and it took a little bit of time to kind of build up and get the money out the door, and it took longer than maybe some people expected. And so there's sort of a just internal capacity issue, which Joe might be able to speak to a little bit more than I can on the kind of executive branch side of things. And the one last thing I'll flag is just again sort of a question that we ask is if we're thinking about establishing a new program, why not sort of rely on kind of existing programs to kind of achieve some of the potential goals that you might have for a new program? I think sometimes we'll kind of see a proposal and ask, well, maybe there's sort of an existing program that tries to achieve some similar goals that we could just maybe modify to try to accomplish the task that's being proposed here. So I'm throwing out a lot of different sort of types of considerations, I guess, that go into when a proposal is put forward before the legislature, the types of things that we might ask and try to get answers to before in order to kind of inform the legislature and policymakers' decisions when they're evaluating that proposal. So maybe I'll hand it over to Joe. He might have a different perspective.
No, I actually, even though we're serving our different roles, I think our office kind of takes similar lenses to proposals when we're reviewing and working with departments and agencies. We also just like really trying to get a good understanding of the existing level of resources, and I think that's something that we've been focused on to a greater extent now these last couple of years, especially given the state's fiscal situation. Like what is the existing level of resources? What and how could they be utilized to meet new priorities or existing priorities before we have to consider adding additional resources. And as we talked about a little bit earlier, the pie is only so big, and so it's also important to understand the priorities that are being addressed and where they fall in line with kind of the urgent needs of the state. So we know in recent years we've had elevated risks of wildfires and experiences with wildfires that that is definitely top of mind in terms of mitigation and ensuring that we have the proper resources in place to respond as necessary when wildfires do occur. We know housing and homelessness, as example, are is one of the big issues that the state has faced in recent years. It's interesting because I think it gets at Ross's point on the LAO understanding what the responsibilities of different levels of government are. That kind of definitely plays into this conversation. But we also know it's a urgent issue that we all face and have to figure out how to address. So that's also given the fact that we don't have an unlimited supply of resources, really try to evaluate what the most urgent needs are and how any new proposals are addressing those needs.
Okay, thank you. We talked a lot about how the LAO and the Department of Finance address, how they approach their work. The question that I'd like to ask now is about other sources of input around the formation of the budget and how it's finally put together. How do individuals or organizations make their perspectives known in the budget process? What are the opportunities available to them, and what have you all seen as being effective and not so effective methods for that kind of advocacy?
So I'll start off and just thing number one is educating yourselves first on the process and the roles that different players play in the process. And so I think that's important to know. That's I think Ross started off, just knowing the timeline of the budget and when to engage is very important. The folks come to the administration or the legislature on, the beginning of June asking for something to be considered in the budget. You've missed the boat at that point. So
Right.
it's important to understand the process and the timeline, and then just knowing who is involved in that process besides our organizations, like knowing specifically within LAO or within Department of Finance who works on any particular issue, and same within the legislature and the budget committees. Each House, the Senate, and the Assembly has a budget committee and budget subcommittees, and each subcommittee is by issue area: education, resource and environment, so on and so forth. And so, understanding not only the members but also the staff for those subcommittees, particularly on the issues that stakeholders are interested in, is important. And that where it gets to engagement of reaching out, writing letters. Thing I would say, always be succinct. Clearly, I think it gets to some of the things that Ross was touching on what his office looks at for when they're evaluating proposals. That same sort of information should be succinctly spelled out in letters that are advocating for any specific budget ask. And then lastly, I'll just say that the budget subcommittee process is really that public part of the process. And so it's also important to go to those subcommittee hearings that are relevant to the issues that that you care about, and to make sure that your voice is heard there.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, as Joe mentioned, I guess, yeah, within the legislative process, there's sort of are these opportunities built in for input and feedback, and through the budget committees in both the Assembly and the Senate, they have on their websites, they actually have, I think, sort of a place where you can submit written letters, comments. The hearings themselves, there's always public comment where they're soliciting input from organizations or individuals. So that's kind of on the budget committee side of things, and then individual legislators themselves. They also, you could also write letters to them and contact kind of an individual legislator themselves to kind of express a preference or opinion or anything along those lines.
Okay. Speaking of expressing an opinion or a preference, want to encourage our audience to please take advantage of the Q&A feature and submit questions for Ross and Joe. We are about 2/3 of the way through our time, and we do want to make sure we leave time for audience questions. So please use the Q&A feature, which you can find on your Zoom toolbar or by clicking More. Okay, here's the Rorschach test portion of our panel. If you had to summarize the governor's budget in one sentence, what would be the central policy story it's trying to tell about California right now?
I'm interested in hearing Ross's answer to this question.
What are we trying to tell what are we trying to tell?
Maybe I can start since it was our proposal.
It's the governor's proposal, right?
And I should say it's kind of a difficult. I'm going to fail the test because it's a difficult question.
No wrong answers. No wrong answers.
Yeah. Because what we've seen in these last few years is that we've just seen heightened levels of uncertainty, and we've also seen some periods of some significant changes in terms of our overall fiscal situation, revenues between January and May, which is the governor's last update to the budget. And so this governor's budget was really about more of a wait and see approach, to not make any drastic decisions in January, and really understand what changes in terms of the landscape of the economy, revenue, spending prior to the May revise, and then at the May revise, really make those more significant changes that are needed to be made in order to ensure a responsible, sound fiscal plan for the state.
Okay. Yeah.
So,
Ross?
David, we do have one question. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, hold on, Ross.
Oh.
Ross gets to answer. Ross gets to answer his.
I mean, I'll cheat a little bit and kind of make my answer focused on kind of the fiscal questions for the state. Maybe less so on sort of the policy ones, but they're very much related, of course, because fiscal condition of the state has big policy implications. But I think the main kind of story is, from our perspective, is the state has seen strong revenue growth that is likely unsustainable, but that has put the state in a position where, at least in the governor's budget, the budget is roughly balanced for the upcoming fiscal year. But over the long term, the state faces substantial structural challenges and structural deficits, which is going to mean some difficult choices ahead trying to balance that budget and close that structural deficit. Difficult choices about what the state's core priorities are and how it wants to align over the long term its revenues and spending.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to turn over to Brad Strout, who's going to moderate the questions from the audience. So, Brad?
So we do have one question from Amandeep. The governor said that we will not be in a deficit during the governor's proposal in January. The LAO, I believe, has disagreed with that statement and that we will still be in a deficit. How does the DOF and the LAO work together when there is a difference like this?
So I can, do you want to go ahead,
No,
Joe,
no,
or do you want me to?
yep,
I can
go ahead.
start. I mean, I guess first thing, and Joe was getting at this a little bit, the budget is sort of a process that kind of where things change along the way, even from sort of January to a few months later. And so you're right that we sort of had a difference in sort of the view of the budget situation for the upcoming year in January. I will add that we did a revenue update recently. I think it was at the end of February, where we sort of revised our view of the revenue situation to, I think, become a little bit more closely aligned to what the governor's budget looked like. And so I think that difference actually kind of shrank in terms of what the kind of fiscal condition is, and then kind of put us, I think, closer to what the governor's budget showed. I think to the kind of second part of the question, how do we work together? This goes back a little bit to, I think, a comment I made earlier on, which is, forecasting revenues, particularly given kind of the volatile revenue structure in California, is a difficult task, and it requires, some judgment that goes into it. Different assumptions sometimes will go into it. Reasonable kind of people and organizations can disagree on what that forecast looks like. We give it our best shot. Department of Finance gives it their best effort, and sometimes we don't come out in the same place. And I think that's we don't sort of view it as our role to kind of align with the Department of Finance. We think there's value in having kind of an independent look at what we think the kind of revenue forecast will look like, what the state's budget picture will look like, provide that to the legislature. They will also have access to, the governor and the Department of Finance's estimates and view of the budget situation. And, so they'll have kind of two different sort of independent perspectives. And, we'll have to kind of take that information into account when kind of making decisions about, how to structure its budget and kind of the overall architecture of the budget. So I guess we don't really sort of see it as like a need to kind of align necessarily. Obviously, we do kind of talk to each other, but when we're developing our estimates, they're really kind of done independently, and we think there's a lot of value in kind of having those two different sets of estimates and kind of thinking through what the state's fiscal picture is.
And I'll just add that, at January, we in terms of the size of the difference in our revenue estimate, it may have been a little bit larger than typically, but as Ross mentioned, they did an update in February, and we're closer together. And would also just say that folks often get caught up on the number, but when we have a close to $350 billion total budget, $250 billion general fund budget, usually the differences are within the margins of error, and it's not that we're really seeing things that much differently. It's just that because of the overall size of California's budget, it looks like there's huge differences between us. And I will just reiterate Ross's point. I think it's process we have here that we don't have to align, but our staff, we both have staff that this is their job. They work on the forecast for California. They communicate all the time. They have conversations, but we're not influencing each other's processes or outcomes. But we are communicating and understanding the approaches that we're taking, and it really feeds to a healthy process.
Hey, great. Brad, do we have any more questions?
I don't see any more at this point.
All right. Well, as the moderator, I do not have any more questions for either of you. I do want to say thank you very much for your candid answers, your dynamic answers. And I think we all are walking away with a much better understanding of the nuts and bolts and the values and issues that drive the work that both the legislative analysts and the Department of Finance both engage in. So just thank you. Thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, David. And thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Jennifer, do we have any closing remarks?
I just want to say on behalf of the Sacramento State Alumni Association and the Hornets Policy and Politics Alumni Chapter, thank you for spending time with us today as panelists, sharing your expertise, your knowledge. It's always very deeply appreciated. And also to our attendees who sacrificed their lunch hour to eat at their desk and learn from you all. And as Sylvia said at the beginning, we will be sharing a recording of this eventually. We have a student go through and do captioning, and so we'll get that out to you. And I hope everybody has a great day.
Right. Awesome.
Stingers
Thanks, everybody.
up. Thank you, everyone.
Fingers up.